Hello and welcome to chapter 18, where we will be discussing nutrition and metabolism. So, first thing first, let's start going through some definitions. Nutrition. Nutrition is the study of nutrients and how the body uses them. When you think about nutrients, typically we'll think about, we'll have this really surface understanding of nutrients. Will say it's a thing that the body needs. But do we ever really understand why or how the body uses them? So think about nutrients as chemicals, right? So nutrients are chemicals that are from the environment, environment meaning something outside of yourself, the air, the water, the land that an organism needs for survival. You are that organism. You need nutrients in order to survive. And in order to thrive while surviving, you need the correct nutrients. These nutrients are used to supply energy to fuel your metabolic processes. They're used as building blocks for producing the different molecules that basically make up your body cells, that make up your tissues. Everything you eat, everything you drink, everything you breathe, it goes into your body and has the potential to be added into who you are. Um, so understanding nutrition, understanding nutrients can is the best way for you to basically build a better version of yourself. There are two major classes of nutrients. You have your macronutrients, your micronutrients. Excuse me. Remember, macro means large, micro means small, very, very small. So macronutrients, the word doesn't have anything to do with the size of the nutrients necessarily, but these are nutrients that are needed in large quantities. The amount of them that you need is large in order to help provide you with the amount of energy that you need to move forward. All right. Macronutrients are required in large quantities. These are things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. So this is typically what you hear about all the time when a quote unquote nutrition expert, a conventional doctor, or someone of the like talks about nutrients. Usually they're talking about these macronutrients, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And they're very important, but they're not the only things we need. We also need micronutrients. Micronutrients are those things that are needed in small amounts, like your vitamins and your minerals. But they're extremely important because if you don't have these micronutrients, you cannot use your macronutrients fully. Excuse me. Here it says that micronutrients help extract the energy from your macronutrients. If you ever have taken biochemistry, or if you ever take biochemistry, one of the things that you may notice is that for all of those biochemical processes, you need micronutrients. So things like magnesium, vitamin C, vitamin B, vitamin B12, vitamin B5, folic acid, all of those are considered micronutrients. But in order to use those macronutrients, you have to have them. All right, so they are important. Another category of nutrients is called essential nutrients. Now, these are essential because your body does not make them. There are many things that are made inside of your body using other molecules as building blocks, but the essential nutrients, your body cannot synthesize them, or your body can't synthesize enough of them to supply the demand that your body needs. All right, so essential nutrients, that means you have to eat them from the environment. You have to get them from the environment, put them into your body so that your body can use them. An example of an essential nutrient is vitamin C. The reason why we need to eat foods that are high in vitamin C is because our bodies simply do not make it, and it's absolutely essential. It's important that we get it in because it's one of those micronutrients that's needed for many of the processes that our bodies go through. Now, we all hear about calories, and we know that food gives us calories, and calories are what we need for energy. But why? Calorie is actually a unit of measurement. A calorie is a unit of measurement, and what they're measuring is unit of heat. That heat that is used to that heat that is released um, during energy production or potential energy production. So, excuse me. When we look at a nutrient and we say it has 120 calories, it has 100 calories, it has 10 calories, we're saying that um, that is a unit of measurement that says how many calories, how much heat can be produced by that thing. And that heat that is produced is a reaction or a byproduct of energy from that food being released and your body being able to use it. A carbohydrate is an organic compound. Carbohydrates include your sugars and your starches. So, as simple as sugar, as complex as starches. The energy that they release or the calories that they hold are held in bonds. So when you look at these different molecules that are being held together, like your oxygens and hydrogens, your carbons and oxygens and hydrogens, etc., what's holding those together is that potential energy, meaning that energy that can be released to help fuel your movements, help fuel your living. Sources of carbohydrates. So there are several different types and categories of carbohydrates that that help to give us energy. And they're put together differently depending on where they're from, what they are, what they're used for. So polysaccharides, remember poly means many, di means two, mono means one. Saccharide refers to a sugar. So polysaccharides have multiple sugars, many sugars as a part of their structure. You have complex carbohydrates like the starches from your plant foods, say your potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, all of those will have your complex carbohydrates. You can also find polysaccharides in meat. So glycogen, we'll discuss this in a bit, but this is a shorter chain sugar or a shorter chain carbohydrate that is found in muscle cells. For those of you who are athletes or have been athletes in the past, your coach may have told you to eat a big carbohydrate-rich meal. Go eat some pasta, go eat some rice the night before an event because they want to make sure that your glycogen stores are filled back up after you've been using them in practice. All right, so that glycogen sits in between the muscle cells, and you can liberate that once you consume the muscle cells, the muscle tissue, and start to break that down. So, glycogen is a polysaccharide. A disaccharide, two sugars or double sugar, includes your milk sugar, so your lactose, cane sugar. Cane sugar is one of the more popular sugars that we find in our foods. All right, so usually we'll be eating cane sugar. Beet sugar. I don't know if you realize how sweet beets are, but um, sugar producers actually used to a lot more than now produce sugar to be sold at the supermarket from beets instead of sugar canes. They are super sweet. And then molasses. Molasses also has disaccharides. And then your monosaccharides are your single sugars. So like your glucose, your sucrose, etc. They come from things like honey and fruit. And understanding the difference between these different carbohydrate sources can help you understand disease processes, even. All right. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later in the chapter. Remember that the process of digestion is a process of breaking things down. You break things down that you consume into their smaller parts, into their molecules, so that your body can use them. So, digestion will break down these complex carbohydrates, like your glycogen found in the meat that you eat or the starch found in the plants that you eat. It'll break those down into disaccharides and then into monosaccharides that are small enough for your body to absorb them, and then your body can start to use it to produce energy. Cellulose is a type of complex carbohydrate that we find a lot in food. Cellulose is a carbohydrate, yes, but your body does not digest it. Your body cannot break it down, which means your body cannot absorb it. And that's okay. The purpose of cellulose, then, since you can't absorb it and use it internally, that purpose becomes fiber to help clean out, brush out, clear out your digestive system of waste. This is why when people don't eat enough fiber-rich foods, the waste tends to stay in their digestive system a little bit longer. That is where we get the concept of constipation. So let's talk about carbohydrate use. Different monosaccharides are absorbed from the digestive tract. You have fructose, galactose, and glucose. Glucose is the one that we hear the most, but fructose and galactose are also monosaccharides that our bodies utilize as often as we eat them. Since glucose is the most common cellular fuel oxidized in glycolysis, the other monosaccharides, your fructose and galactose, are then converted into glucose by certain enzymes that are located in the liver. So basically, what that means is your body you will consume several types of carbohydrates, right? Some of them will be simple. Some of them will be monosaccharides. You'll have some disaccharides, but oftentimes we're consuming these complex um, polysaccharides. So your body during the digestive process will break those down into their monosaccharide parts, and you'll be able to absorb them. Your body can use the glucose directly. It can go through the process of glycolysis. So glyco meaning sugar, lysis meaning breaking or cutting, right? Not cutting, breaking. So glycolysis is breaking down that glucose into even smaller and smaller parts so that you can use it to obtain energy. When you have fructose and galactose, your body will basically take those molecules, they'll be floating around in the bloodstream. This is blood sugar. And once it floats to the liver can take that fructose, the liver can take that galactose, use the right enzymes to actually convert those into glucose so that then that those glucose molecules can find its way through the glycolysis process. Right? When glucose is broken down for energy, the byproducts end up being carbon dioxide and water. So, where do we find the most carbon dioxide? Usually, when we think carbon dioxide, we think lungs and respiration. We think the respiratory system. But how did it get there? So, remember that um, go back to the cell, like the biology of a cell. The powerhouse of the cell, right? Y'all know what that is. The powerhouse of the cell is the mitochondria. The reason why mitochondria is considered the powerhouse of the cell is because that is where your ATP is produced in highest quantities. And remember that you utilize oxygen in order to make that ATP. So inside each cell, your mitochondria will use the breakdown products of glucose along with oxygen to produce energy, and the byproducts of that will be carbohydrates and water being produced. There's several steps that go into this. It's not one immediate thing, but do know it starts off at glucose, and then it goes through several different cycles, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, etc. And eventually it gets broken down into the energy you need, the ATP, and the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. Your body utilizes the water, and the carbon dioxide is the waste product that goes back into your bloodstream, and eventually it goes to the lungs, and you get that gas exchange. So your lungs can excrete the carbon dioxide as waste, and then gather some new oxygen in order to use that then to make more energy. If you have excess glucose, you have more energy, you have more glucose than you're using in that moment, that glucose then is converted to glycogen. Remember, we said that glycogen, let me go back. Glycogen is, where is it? Where is it? Anyway, I'm not seeing it. But glycogen, we said, was found in meats, right? We just said that it was a part of what is found in between the meat cells. So, whatever you're not using in that moment, your body is going to first start storing it as glycogen so that you have more of those reserves to use if you do more work than normal. The glycogen is stored in your muscle cells as well as in your liver. So again, those of you who are or have been athletes, this is why your coach would tell you to carb load the night before an event so that you can have more glycogen stored so that when you use your glucose, you have the glycogen, which is shorter chain carbohydrates or shorter chain glucose molecules put together, and it's easier access. After you store a certain amount of glycogen, after you fill up those reserves, if you still have glucose left over, that glucose is then converted into fat cells. And it's converted to fat, well, it's converted to fat that is then added to your adipose cells. That process is called lipogenesis. Remember, lipo means fat, genesis means to create, to the beginning, right? To start something. So you are creating fat. That fat is then stored in your adipose cells, your adipose tissue. Many cells can break down fatty acids for energy, but some of them require glucose. All right. So not all cells in your body can use fat or be able to break fat down to use as energy. Some of them can only use glucose. For the vast majority of the other cells, your body will, after you use your glucose that's more readily available, your body can start to tap into the fat stores that you have. So that can be abdominal fat, the fat around your muscles, the fat around your organs. It can use that for energy. Um, Then you have gluconeogenesis. We already said that genesis is the beginning, it's the creation, it's the production of something. Neo, neo means new, right? Gluco means glucose. So this is the production of new glucose molecules, gluconeogenesis. This is how the body converts non-carbohydrates, so some other molecules outside of carbohydrates, in order to produce glucose. It actually converts things like amino acids. Remember that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. It can take those amino acids and produce, turn those into glucose molecules for those cells that actually require glucose as energy. So remember, some cells can use lipid as an energy source, but some cells cannot. And if they cannot, then instead of using lipid, your body can make glucose from other molecules. So this is basically the process of how the body will convert some monosaccharides into glucose. All of these are sugar, and the chemical code or the chemical abbreviation of sugar is C6H12O6, meaning you have six molecules of carbon in all of these. H12. If you count all the H's or the hydrogens in each of these molecules, there will be 12. And O6, you have six oxygen molecules. So fructose, glucose, and galactose all have that same basic chemical structure, C6H12O6. But how these things are arranged, that is what determines which type of monosaccharide it is. And if you're eating galactose and fructose, remember your body can't use those directly to go through the glycolysis process. So then these go to the liver and they are converted, right? So this galactose, um, you have this section here, right? So this OH and this H are basically shifted to the opposite side to create glucose. And your fructose, you have here, instead of having the double bond there, you have a double bond in a different place, and that OH molecule is moved to a different carbon. All right, so this fructose, basically by shifting some of the oxygen and hydrogens, you create glucose, and it's that glucose that can go through the glycolysis process. For those of you who are visual, make sure that you look this over. This is another way that these are broken down and utilized in the body. So your starches broken down to glucose. Your sucrose is broken down to glucose and fructose. Maltose is broken down to glucose. Lactose broken down to glucose and galactose. So you can see where you get your fructose and galactose, and these are the ones that we just said were converted to glucose in the liver and then can go through glycolysis. You then take these products, these monosaccharides, and you use them in processes like respiration, right? So you respire to help produce energy. Glycogenesis, so producing glycogen to be stored in your muscle cells, or lipogenesis. You produce fat cells from the monosaccharides. Carbohydrate requirements. Carbohydrate requirements. So, carbohydrates are your primary source of fuel for your cells to work. You need carbohydrates um, in varying amounts depending on your unique chemistry. It also depends on the stage of development you're in and how much energy you produce. So, the amount of carbohydrates a newborn needs is different from the amount of carbohydrates that person needs as a toddler, as a preteen, as a teenager, as an adult, and as an elder. Same human, but different needs because of different stages of growth. And that same person might have different needs from a day to day because of their different activity levels. So, that's what this means when it says the need for carbohydrates varies with individual energy requirements. Minimal requirements for carbohydrates in the human diet is unknown. Nobody really knows what the minimum amount of carbohydrates are that a human can survive on. But At this point, we feel like it might be at least 125 to 175 grams per day. The average diet in the US gives us 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. So this is basically why those in the US, like the US is starting to get bigger and bigger because if our needs are 125 to 175 and we're taking up to 300 grams of carbohydrates per day, we are at minimum twice the amount of carbohydrates that we need. And so a lot of that will be turned into uh, fat cells through the process of lipogenesis because we're taking in more than we need in those moments. Lipids. So lipids are organic compounds that include your fats, your oils, your phospholipids. So remember phospholipids. Where have you heard that before? You've heard of a phospholipid bilayer. This is how your cell membranes are created. We know that they are fatty, right? And that's why things that are made of fat have an easier time to get across that cell membrane than things that are made of or love water. Those lipophilic things are easier to go across the membranes than your hydrophilic things. Cholesterol is also a type of fat. So all of those are considered lipids. Lipids are an energy source, but they serve as more of a reserve energy. All right, energy reserve, meaning you can use it for energy a little bit later on um, when you need it and you may not have glucose available. Triglycerides are a type of lipid. Triglycerides are composed of a glycerol backbone, so that glyceride part is the glycerol backbone. And then you have three fatty acids. The tri part refers to the three fatty acids. So it's glycerol with three fatty acids attached to it. That is what a triglyceride is. It's the most common type of lipid that you're going to eat. All right. So when someone talks about fats being in the diet, they're talking about triglycerides, that glycerol backbone with the three fatty acids attached. Sources of lipids. So, triglycerides are found in your plant-based foods and your animal-based food. Basically, you get triglycerides from anything that you eat that comes from a plant or an animal. You have different categories of lipids. You have your saturated fats, you have your unsaturated fats, you have cholesterol. So, when we talk about saturated and unsaturated fats, remember that these are organic compounds. Organic in this sense, and when we're talking about chemistry, organic basically means that it is a carbon-based molecule. These are carbon-based molecules. Remember how your glucose and galactose, etc., were carbon-based. You had those carbon backbones, and then you had the oxygen and hydrogen that were attached to those. Well, your fats are also have carbons in them. So when you're looking at those fats, what type of bonds do they have in the molecules? The types of bonds they have in the molecules will decide whether they are saturated or unsaturated. Your saturated fats come mainly from foods that come from animal sources. Right. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So, saturated fats are mainly found in foods that come from animals. So, meat, eggs, milk, lard. All of those are animal products, animal byproducts. You can also find your saturated fats in some oils that come from plants, like your palm oils and your coconut oils. So when we say saturated, we basically mean that there are no double bonds between the carbon atoms in the fatty acids. So these molecules are saturated with single bonds. All right, they're saturated with single bonds, no double bonds at all. Saturated fats have been found to have an associated risk with cardiovascular disease. That doesn't mean that your body doesn't need um, saturated fats or that saturated fats cannot be healthy for you, like your coconut oil and your palm oil. They can be, but if you eat them in excess along with these other sources of saturated fat, that's when we get into the problems. So let's not look at it as 100% unhealthy. Just know that we need a variety. All right. That's why there's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease the more saturated fats you eat. Unsaturated fats are those that are found in things like seeds, nuts, oils that come from plants outside of coconut and palm. So, like your avocado oil, your olive oil, those types of plant oils, all of those have unsaturated fats. And basically, what we mean is that at least one of the bonds between carbon molecules are actually double bonds. All right, so it's unsaturated because these are not saturated with single bonds. You have at least one, possibly more, double bonds between carbon atoms. Mono unsaturated fats seem to be the healthiest. Mono meaning one, so that would be those unsaturated fats that have one double bond. They seem to be the healthiest. Cholesterol. Cholesterol is a type of fat found in basically from animal products. You do not get cholesterol from plant-based products. So, sidebar, whenever you are being advertised to, whenever you're looking at labels, you're looking at advertising, you're looking at commercials, oftentimes the people that are advertising will say things like, and this has no cholesterol in it, as a marketing ploy, right? They do that because as soon as they say no cholesterol, you're like, oh, this must be healthy. But here's the thing. If it's a plant-based product, it doesn't have cholesterol anyway. So, if you eat like kale, lettuce, carrots, none of those have cholesterol in them because they are plant-based. Cholesterol is found in animal-based products, all animal-based products. You are an animal, right? You are considered an animal when you look at it phylogenetically, and you make cholesterol because you're not a plant. So, cholesterol will be found abundantly in the liver and in egg yolks. You'll also find some in milk, butter, cheese, and meats. Again, all animal products, all right? So, how does the body use lipids? Lipids in food include phospholipids. We already talked about that. We most commonly see that around cell membranes. Cholesterol. We've seen cholesterol as a backbone of steroid hormones. And now we know that cholesterol is used to make bile that is produced by the liver that helps your body to process, utilize, and then remove fats from the body. And most commonly, your fats and triglycerides. Remember, triglycerides are the most common lipid that you're going to take in as a food source. Lipids will mainly supply energy. Remember that they are a source of stored energy, their potential energy in the body. It contains more than twice as much chemical energy per gram as carbohydrates and proteins, meaning if you have 1 gram of sugar, we know how much energy that produces. If we have 1 gram of meat, we know how much energy each of those molecules will produce. 1 gram of fat will has the potential to give us twice as much energy as either carbohydrate or protein. All right, so twice as much chemical energy per gram as carbohydrates or proteins. Your triglycerides are broken down into, once you start utilizing them, they're broken down into those constituent parts. It's broken down to that glycerol and those three fatty acids. As opposed to being one unit, we break that down in order to release the energy that's stored in the bonds that make up those triglycerides. All right, so broken down into the glycerol, backbone, and those fatty acids in order to release the energy from those bonds. Glycerol and the fatty acids can then be used to synthesize storage fats in adipose tissue. So once you take those triglycerides and you break them down to release that energy, you can actually go back and utilize those individual fatty acids and that glycerol to make some new adipose tissue that can be more stored energy for later. Excess glucose or amino acids can be and are converted into fat molecules. So, sidebar. When you hear people say not to eat so much fatty foods because that's going to turn into fat in the body, they are correct, but please note that a good bit of the fat that we have is not because we've been eating fatty foods. It's actually because we've been eating foods high in carbohydrates. And that excess carbohydrate and glucose is then turned into fat. So, if you want to start to lose weight or release some of the fat cells, fat molecules from the adipose tissue that you have, then you probably will do better to decrease the amount of carbohydrates that you have, that you're taking in, along with increasing how much your body is moving throughout a day. I will let you look through this on your own. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But it should be pretty self-evident that your fats from the foods that you eat are broken down with water. So hydrolysis is using water to break those down. Remember that the fats are triglycerides. Usually that's what we're talking about. That's broken down into your glycerol and your fatty acids. And then those go through their own processes to help to produce energy. And that energy, once you produce, the byproduct of producing energy is heat. And then you also have your carbon dioxide and your water. Lipid uses, part two. So, the liver can convert fatty acids from one form to another. Remember, the liver has well over 500 different jobs. One of those jobs is to convert things from one form to another. The liver cannot synthesize certain fatty acids. So even if these are fatty acids that your body absolutely needs to function, if your liver cannot synthesize them, then we consider those essential. So we already talked about your essential nutrients. These are ones that your body cannot produce. We're being more specific now that we have some fatty acids that are essential because our body needs them, but we don't produce them on our own. We have to obtain them from the food that we eat. Lipids can be combined with other things like proteins. That's where we get our lipoproteins. All right, so lipoproteins are basically you have a protein that has a lipid attached to it, or you have a lipid that has a protein attached to it. That is a lipoprotein. These are classified based on their density. How heavy are they? How heavy are they? As proportions of lipids decrease, the density increases. What this means is you're talking about lipoproteins, right? So we know that we have a molecule that has a lipid and a protein attached to each other. How much lipid versus how much protein is in each individual molecule will affect how dense or how heavy it is. The more lipid you have, the less dense it is. The more protein you have, the more dense it is. Think about it this way. If you were to take a teaspoon of olive oil and pour it in a cup of water, that teaspoon of olive oil will float to the top. If you take a teaspoon of meat and you pour it into a cup of water, that teaspoon of meat is going to sink. The meat is much more dense than the oil. The protein is much more dense than the lipid. So if you have more proteins in a molecule, then it is going to be heavier or more dense than if you have more lipid. And so the next terms that we go over, that is how these are classified, and that is what you want to consider. So lipids, lipoproteins are used in lipid transport to specific cells. So remember when we talked about your steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are made up of a lipid backbone, a cholesterol backbone. Because oil and water don't mix, the hormone by themselves or the lipid by itself, it can't easily go through the bloodstream to get from one place to another. In order to get there, it must attach itself to a protein in order to travel through that water-based environment to get from one place to another. So that's what this is talking about when it says that lipoproteins are used in lipid transport to specific target cells. So now the classifications are your VLDLs, your LDLs, your HDLs. And you may have heard these when people are talking about this is healthy, this is not healthy. Let's talk about why. VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. Low density, meaning it's very, very light. It's not heavy at all. It doesn't have a lot of density. So these would include your triglycerides. Remember that it has a glycerol backbone and three fatty acids. That means that it has lots of lipid, lots of fat, which means it's going to float on water a lot more because it doesn't have as much protein attached. It's not going to be heavy at all. Very low density. Then you have your LDLs that are low density. So they're not quite as light. They don't have quite as much lipid, or they have more protein attached to them than the VLDLs, but they still have a good amount of lipid. All right, so they're still low density because there's a high amount of lipid attached, just not as much as the VLDL. These would be the cholesterols. All right, so your cholesterols are considered LDLs or low density lipoproteins. Now you have your high density lipoproteins. These are the lipoproteins that have much more protein attached to it. HDLs are the ones that are considered much more healthy, even though our body needs all three of them. Your liver controls the cholesterol levels that your body makes. Cholesterol is produced by the liver and then released into the bloodstream. That cholesterol is also that your body produces is then able to be used to make things like bile salts in your digestive process. It can also be used to make hormones, your steroid hormones. So these cholesterols are excreted in bile. Your adipose tissue, so you have these adipose cells that are waiting for more and more adipose molecules to be created so that they can basically get bigger and bigger and bigger. Your adipose tissue is what stores and releases your triglycerides as needed. So the more carbohydrates you eat, The more those carbohydrates are then converted into triglycerides and stored in the adipose tissue for later. And then once you use up all your glucose and your glycogen, your body can then tap into the triglycerides in those adipose tissues in order to break them down and use them as energy sources. Let's stop there. We will continue the next slide with in the next video.